I think we're ready when both of you are.
Okay, good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Reiko Huang. I'm an associate professor in the International Affairs Department at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, and I will be serving as the moderator this evening. I am thrilled, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Valerie Hudson. Dr. Hudson is a university distinguished professor, which represents the highest honor given by the Texas A&M University on its faculty, as well as the George H.W. Bush Chair and Professor in the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Dr. Hudson is a renowned expert on international security, foreign policy analysis, and gender and security. In 2009, Foreign Policy named her one of the top 100 most influential global thinkers. More recently, she was named a Distinguished Scholar of Foreign Policy Analysis by the International Studies Association, and these are some of the many accolades she has garnered over the years. Professor Hudson is an award-winning author of several books, including Bare Branches, Security Implications of Asia's Surplus Male Population, Sex and World Peace, and the Hillary Doctrine, Sex in American Foreign Policy, as well as numerous articles in leading academic journals. Her scholarship has garnered attention of popular media, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, BBC, the CNN, and numerous other outlets. At the Bush School, Dr. Hudson directs the program on women, peace, and security, and teaches highly popular courses on women and nations and on foreign policy analysis. Speaking more personally, Valerie has been an invaluable mentor and friend in my time as a faculty member at the Bush School, and I know her mentorship has been a tremendous benefit to many other faculty and students as well. Today, she will be speaking on her latest book titled The First Political Order: How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide, published earlier this year by Columbia University Press. Please join me in virtually welcoming Professor Valerie Hudson.
Hello, everyone. I am really excited to be here. And I'm very grateful to Reiko Huang for her kind introduction. I'm also very grateful to the Scowcroft Institute and its director, Andrew Natsios, for helping to make this event possible, as well as Lauren herself, who has been invaluable in helping us to put this all together. So thank you and welcome. I'm going to present a PowerPoint for about 35, maybe 40 minutes. And then the part of the discussion I'm really looking forward to is the Q&A, where we'll get to interact together. And Professor Huang, my valued colleague, is going to moderate that discussion. And so without further ado, let me see if I can share my screen and we can get this PowerPoint up. So let's see if this will all work. Okay. And all righty. Okay, Lauren or Reiko, does everything look okay? I can't see your video, so
It's looking
if
good.
One of you could just, thank you very, very much. All righty. I'm excited to tell you about this new, when academics do their work over decades, at some point they write what they consider to be kind of their magnum opus, which is kind of the culmination of a lot of what they've done in their research career. And this book represents that for me. It's called The First Political Order: How Sex Shapes Governance and National Security Worldwide. Even though it only took us about 4 years to write, it took me a couple of decades to amass the kind of knowledge and detail and understanding that you see in its pages. One of my sweet friends told me, hey, if reading the book doesn't convince them, you can throw it at them because it's 612 pages. It's kind of built like a brick. So I hope that you will take a look at the book when you get the chance. I think Lauren distributed that there's, they even give you an author code for 30% off. So if you're on the edge, let me know and we'll make sure that you get that. Let's see here. Let's see if I can, there we go. All right. Well, the premise that we start from is a premise that it will not be unfamiliar to most of you. And certainly we didn't come up with this premise, but I want to reiterate it and I want to kind of turn it in the direction of looking at nation states. And that fundamental proposition is that the first political order in any society is actually the sexual political order established between men and women. And I believe that the character of that first political order deeply molds the society, its governance, and even its behavior, as we will see in this presentation. Sometimes when I'm teaching my Women and Nations class, I'll say, okay, let's pretend that instead of an international affairs class, you're in a video game design class. And I want you to design a video game for me. And I say, I'm only going to give you 2 parameters and then you take it away. And I say, all right, within your game, there are roughly 2 equal groups within that game. And if those 2 groups cannot cooperate, there is no second round. It's all over. And then at that point, they say, well, that's not enough to go on, Professor Hudson, you have to tell us more. So I say, so like, what is it that you want to know more? And then they ask me some interesting questions. They ask me, will these 2 groups, do they stand before each other as equals, or is one kind of superior and one kind of inferior? And then, so like, how does this group make decisions, right? Are both groups involved in the decision making, or does one group make the decisions? And if there's a conflict between the 2 groups, how's that conflict resolved? Is it resolved by force? Is it resolved by compromise? And then lastly, the ultimate question is, how are valuable resources allocated between these 2 groups? Are these valuable resources shared, or are these valuable resources pretty much the purview of one group and not the other? And I say, bingo, all right? What you've just asked me are deeply political questions. These are questions about power. And I want you to see then that the first political order in any society is the answer to these questions between men and women. And you can imagine a continuum, right? Where some societies are more toward the end, where it's a hierarchical relationship based on force and domination. But you can imagine that there's a spectrum, and that perhaps at the other end, you might find an ideal type where men and women stand before each other as equals and decision-making is shared as our resources. So we're not saying, right, that there's only one type of first political order, right? But that the type of first political order, where your nation state falls on that spectrum, is going to have outsized effects on your society and on your nation state. Okay, now, so the next question is, like, where do you go to see the first political order within a society? And for about 15 years, I looked for hints, the first political order in places that I think would occur to most social science researchers. I looked at female literacy rates, female educational attainment rates. I looked at female labor force participation. I looked at female parliamentary representation. And then one day, about 12 years ago, I had one of those crucial conversations that people talk about. I was at another university, and the university was hosting a contingent of the first wave of female members of the Loya Jirga, the parliament in Afghanistan. And I was assigned to particularly host and take care of one MP. And so we were having lunch together, and you feel a little awkward, you're not sure what to say. So I thought I'd say something encouraging. So I said, wow, when I look at you, I'm just, blown away. Here you are, you're university educated, you're a doctor, you've had a career as a pediatrician, Now you're one of the first female parliamentarians in your country. This is the future for Afghanistan. All right, this is a generation of empowered women. And she stopped me right there and she said, Valerie, you don't seem to understand. She said, I could go home today and my husband could say, I divorce you 3 times and I would be divorced. And if he did, I would not have custody of my children because in Afghanistan, custody goes to the father. And if I was divorced, I would have nowhere to go. I couldn't live alone. And my father's family could not take me in for the dishonor of it. I would have literally nowhere to go. And she said, even if my husband doesn't divorce me, I may have very little say in things like whom my children are going to marry or at what age they marry. And she ended by saying, so how empowered am I really, Valerie? And that really brought me up short. And then as a researcher, I went out and I discovered that you can have high female literacy rates in societies that deeply oppress women. You can have high female labor participation in societies that severely subordinate women. You can have high female parliamentary representation. A case in point is Rwanda that has over 60% female legislators. And yet Rwanda is a society that severely subordinates women. So I was looking in the wrong place for signs of the first political order and its character. And so then I kind of shifted course and I said, well, what would I need to look at in order to see that first political order? And I began to understand it was by looking at the empowerment of women at the household level. That is, how much say does a woman have about getting married? And how old is she when she gets married on average? How much say does a woman have within her marriage, within the decisions that are being made at that level? What types of property and inheritance rights do women have compared to those of her husband or of her brothers? Are there inequities in family law, such as this woman was telling me about in divorce and child custody that disadvantage women? Is marriage patrilocal, where the woman leaves and goes to her groom's family to live? Are bride price or dowry paid? Is polygyny or cousin marriage prevalent? All of these very subordinative practices. Does society view domestic violence and femicide as normal, even expected, even obligatory for reasons of honor in certain situations? And lastly, another big tip off is whether rape is treated as a property crime. That is, the crime is not against the woman, but the crime is actually committed against the father of the woman or the husband of the woman if she's married. I think this is where you're going to find the first political order. So my co-authors and I began to operationalize sort of our understanding of what kinds of practices were interwoven together to create a highly subordinative first political order. And so you can see that right here. And we kind of call it a syndrome because, in fact, if you have one of these, you're liable to have more than one. And if you have 3 or 4, you're liable to have 5 or 6. They kind of attach each other like magnetic beads, almost impossible to pull apart. So if we start in the upper left, we can see by willingness by males to violently coerce females is probably really at the taproot of all of this. But it begins to metastasize into males controlling access to valuable resources and women lacking rights to access those resources. Patrilineality, patrilocal marriage, and often cousin marriage begin to develop. And then as they do, right, as the families begin to be defined in patrilineal terms, that is, the men of the family are the family, and the women are going to marry out or marry in and are more or less outsiders to the family, then you begin to see the rising of son preference. And as you do, as your group begins to favor sons, it's going to begin to devalue the lives of daughters and wives, and there'll be lower investment in females in that society. As a result, you begin to see a depressed age of marriage for girls, where girls may often be married off at puberty because otherwise they're simply a burden on the family. What develops from all of this is a deep inequity in family law and custom and personal status law and custom. In many societies, even today, women are legal minors. They are not legally adults. They are legal minors under the guardianship of a husband or a father. And as we saw with this MP from Afghanistan, may have very unequal divorce rights and so forth. Then coming up the left-hand side there, we also see kind of two manifestations of this desire to subordinate women. If women's labor is considered valuable, that is productive, you'll usually see the rising of customs of bride price and polygyny. That is, a groom will need to pay the bride's father for the purposes of contracting marriage. And then rich men who can afford to pay multiple bride prices are able to marry polygynously. When women's labor is considered to be not valuable, what we see often is the arising, as we do in India, of a dowry and sex ratio alteration type of society, where the bride's family has to pay the groom's family to contract the marriage, and where such dowry prices may be so ruinous that you would actually cull girls from your family population through sex-selective abortion or female infanticide. So you can see how these things kind of hang together, right? Very difficult, almost like a straitjacket for women. But what I'm here to tell you, and this is where I think my co-authors and I make our contribution, is to suggest that it is not simply a straitjacket for women. It is a straitjacket for the entire society. That this is a monster of frightened men, and that it traps not only women, but it traps children and men and entire societies into a less optimal outcome than you would otherwise have with a different kind of first political order. So we think this syndrome, we kind of call it the syndrome in our book, and we suggest that what you're seeing with the creation of this syndrome is the creation, if you will, of a mechanism by which physical security can be given to the group through male kin networks. And that reliance on those male kin networks, some call them clans, some call them tribes, leads to very unfortunate outcomes for the group. We argue it leads to instability, violence, conflict, terror, corruption, and autocracy. Why? Because it is built upon those very same characteristics at the level of the first political order: domestic instability, domestic violence, domestic terror, domestic corruption, domestic autocracy. And that furthermore, this type of first political order within the household also creates negative consequences along other types of dimensions. So we argue that this will also undermine health, right? Since health caretaking is a highly gendered phenomenon, when you disempower the caretakers, when you disempower women, you're going to get poorer health outcomes. We also argue there will be rising food insecurity, low economic performance, a dependence on a rentier type system, demographic woes, and lack of attention to environmental security. So in other words, our grand hypothesis is what you do to your women is what you do to your nation state. And that if you curse your women, you will curse your nation state. So we were able, with the help of the US Department of Defense, very kindly through their Minerva Initiative, offered us $1.3 million to see if there was anything to this proposition. So we were able to go out and operationalize these variables, that is, go out and code them for the various nations of the world and create an index, if you will, an index of that continuum. So there'll be nations that have very few of those syndrome components. And then at the other side of the scale, many nations that have many of the components. And you can imagine what an interesting data collection effort that was. Some of these variables had no existing data on it, all right, in terms of cross-national data. Example, prevalence of patrilocal marriage. Go find it. Well, it doesn't exist. We had to create it, and we had to go out and collect the data. And that's why without the US Department of Defense, we would never have been able to conduct this research. So I don't think that the map that you see here is much of a surprise, right? Where we know that there are certain bands, certain regions within the world that are very highly subordinative of women. And yet we also know that there are areas denoted in yellow that still have a pretty important legacy of subordination of women that still presents itself in the lives of women today. A case in point is China. All right, China is a communist nation. Gender equality is like totally enshrined in their constitution and their laws. And yet 97% of farming land rights go from a man to a man. That is, women are completely cut out. There's bride price in Chinese society. There's all sorts of legacies, if you will, from the millennia of the subordination of women in China that still play out in women's lives today and act as a force for subordination. All right, so at this point, I hope that you're asking yourself, well, okay, so like, give me a couple of examples so I can understand why you think there's a linkage between what's happening with women and what's happening at the level of nation state stability and security. Okay, I'm here to give you two possible examples. Okay, one is an example of a linkage that I would contend is kind of more immediate and proximate in nature. Surging bride prices. Remember, we talked about bride price is the valuables and goods and money that must be transferred from the groom and his family to the bride's family upon the contracting of a marriage. Well, in bride price societies, this ends up forming, if you will, or creating a regressive and universal flat tax on the subpopulation of young men. In bride price societies, there's usually a going rate for a bride. You either have it or you don't. Now, at the very top end, the very elite end, the daughters of the elite may command a very high bride price, but for most within the society, all right, there's a going rate. Well, not unlike the real estate markets, bride price levels often rise. And when they do, they can rise dramatically and swiftly. Okay, as every father is looking at every other father to see how much bride price is being charged, you can begin to get these inflationary bubbles really, really quickly. Governments, right, of bride price societies often note this and try to hold or cap bride price or wedding costs. But even so, bride price will tend to inexorably rise because it's very difficult to enforce such rules. And surging bride price often leads to a greater prevalence of polygyny because as bride price rises, poorer young men drop out of being viable in the marriage market while rich men can still afford to buy brides. And of course, polygyny further obstructs the marriage market for young men, taking more and more women out of the marriage market. Well, what we see is the development of a deep sense of grievance among young men because their marriage prospects are significantly delayed or even precluded. You know, to Westerners, this may seem a little weird. We're kind of in, you know, a post-marriage society where marriage may or may not be important to one's social prospects and standing. But in more traditional societies, marriage for young men is absolutely essential. It is the marker delineating a boy from a man. And the birth of that first son is the difference between having a respected place in the patrilineal family tree and not having a place at all. So this is not something that's, you know, sort of trivial This is something that's obligatory and very important. Now, as you can imagine, being strategic actors, rebel groups, insurgent groups, even terror groups, notice that there is a growing subpopulation of aggrieved young men who are very upset at the established order, which has consigned them basically to be, boys for the rest of their lives. And they offer to solve the problems for these young men by either saying, we're going to allow you to access the kind of resources that will enable you to pay those bride prices, or by actually physically kidnapping the girls themselves to use as brides. And so that's what we see with groups like Boko Haram. I'm sure that you're familiar with, the kidnap of the Chibok schoolgirls and other types of kidnappings there. But something that the media did not report is that all of this was consequent to a huge jump in bride price in northern Nigeria in the early 2000s, where marriage got completely out of the reach of normal young men. And that Boko Haram began to use this as an explicit recruiting strategy. And their approach was to simply abduct the girls themselves. And again, what the Western media did not report is that they always left a token bride price on the ground as the group left, because that legitimized the marriage. It made the marriages legitimate. One young lady who was subjected to this, poignantly but very bluntly pointed out, the tie-in here. In this crisis, these men can take a wife at no extra charge. Usually it is very expensive to take a wife, very hard to get married, but not now. Interestingly, various scholars have begun to note the linkage between bride price, which is a practice subordinative of women, and conflict and rebel group recruitment in South Sudan, in Pakistan, and in Timor-Leste. And I believe that as this research agenda becomes more broadly based, we're going to see more examples as well. All right, my second example is the example of a linkage between what's going on with women and what's going on with national security that is a little bit more longer term and structural in its nature. And here, what I'd like to use as my example is the increasing masculinization of the world's population. You may or may not know that in an unmanipulated population, the overall sex ratio is about 98 men per 100 women. And the reason that it's not even Steven is because women tend to live longer than men, even in the richest societies. However, there are a number of nations where that ratio is abnormal. And that has pushed the global sex ratio from 98 men per 100 women to 101.8 men per 100 women. So it is actually the case that women are no longer half of the population of the world. We are less than half of the population of the world. And this is not due to some sort of natural disaster or plague. This is entirely man-made. And I think it's one of the mega trends of the 21st century that we should be talking about more. Now, when I first started to study sex ratios back in the 90s, in 1990, we could only find 5 nations that had abnormal birth sex ratios, indicating that sex-selective abortion was taking place. And 2 of those were Hong Kong and Macau, which subsequently became part of China. So it was still fairly, localized at that time. But in now, what we're looking at, and of course the 2020 censuses aren't in yet, so I'm very interested to see what happens to this list. But now we count 18. So, and it's not confined to Asia. So Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, China with Hong Kong, Georgia, India, Kosovo, Latvia, Lebanon, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, Serbia, Taiwan, Vanuatu, and Vietnam. So this ancient evil of son preference and culling girls from the population, that's actually spread. Furthermore, migrant flows, of course, alter this as well. In 2015, when the first huge wave of migrants came to Europe, Sweden was a country that opened its doors. And of course, the first wave of migrants, 85% plus in first wave of migration, is almost always young adult men who are best able to stand the rigors of that kind of journey. Sweden not only opened its doors, but it also said something fateful. It said that it would never deport anyone who was under 18 at the time that they came to Sweden for any reason. And so you had many young men coming to Sweden and claiming to be 16 or 17, when in fact, of course, they were not 16 or 17 at all. And then Sweden took a look the very next year at their sex ratios. And to their horror, they discovered that the sex ratio among their 16 to 17-year-old population was 123 young men for every 100 young women. And this, in fact, was a far worse ratio than what China had among its 16 and 17-year-olds. That ratio was only 117 men per 100 women. And the resulting outcry among the Swedish people and the various Swedish feminist groups resulted in Sweden closing their doors to migration because they felt that their goal of gender equality was actually being undermined by their immigration policy. So what are the consequences of having a highly masculinized sex ratio? Well, here the corpus of empirical literature is quite robust and is gaining in volume with every passing year. Masculinized sex ratios are associated with higher crime rates, higher political protest rates. It's also associated with surging bride prices. At the turn of the century, the bride price in China was not very large, about 20,000 renminbi. Now the average bride price is 250,000 renminbi as the results of the culling of girls from the Chinese birth population is beginning to take hold. And of course, the surging rebel recruitment, right, is associated with marriage market obstruction. Crimes against women begin to rise inexorably, including trafficking and forced prostitution. And this is also associated with mobility restriction for women, who then have to be far more careful that they don't end up trafficked themselves or the victim of a violent crime, such as rape or femicide. Forced prostitution and trafficking is also associated with a rise in HIV and STD spread. And it's also true that this may, in fact, have consequences for international deterrence. If you're familiar with the concept of a war of attrition, countries that have highly masculinized sex ratios may look at wars of attrition very differently than societies that have a more equal sex ratio. So it may undermine deterrence where this masculinization has occurred. All right. Well, the Department of Defense did not pay us to do qualitative case studies. They paid us to actually give them some what they consider to be hard evidence, which to the Defense Department involved large and aggregate statistical testing. So that's exactly what we did. It took us 4 years, 2014 to 2018, but we did it. As I mentioned, we operationalized those syndrome variables. And then using a series of control variables that would nuance whether the association still held in the presence of other things, such as ethnic fractionalization, as well as colonial heritage and urbanization and other variables. We then examined 9 different categories of nation state outcomes. So we were looking at political stability and governance indicators, security and conflict indicators, economic performance, volunteerism, health and well-being, demographic security, education, social progress, and even environmental protection. And the last, my co-authors had to talk me into, because I thought, what's the relationship here? And they said, well, Valerie, how you treat women is how you're going to treat Mother Earth. All right, so if you subordinate and exploit women, you're going to subordinate and exploit Mother Earth. So we're sure that there's an association. So I said, fine, we'll include environmental preservation variables. Now, we used two different means of making sure that no one could accuse us of somehow doctoring the data. So the first thing we did is that we chose as our cutoff for statistical significance p less than or equal to 0.001, which is virtually never used in social science research because it's just absurdly rigorous. And the second thing that we did was that we looked at multiple different operationalizations of the outcome variables so that no one could accuse us of having cherry-picked a particular formulation of a variable to meet our hypotheses. So you're not meant to read this slide, but what you see here is that we used 122 outcome variables. All right, so if you read them through, you can see all sorts of things here. Some of them look redundant because various people had operationalized the very same phenomenon differently. And we wanted to make sure that our statistical analysis was robust to whichever conceptualization and operationalization was used. All right, our findings. Well, I think the Department of Defense got their money's worth. Because our findings were really quite strong. So we looked to see, first of all, whether this syndrome variable controlling for the control variables was significantly, remember 0.001, associated with these outcome variables, and what kind of effect size did it have within the model? Was it like the first or the second highest effect size in the model, or was it, further on down the line? So using that as sort of a benchmark, right, we were able to find that across the measures of political instability and freedom and autocracy in 93.8% of the model runs, whether women were subordinated, right, had a determinative association with the outcome variables. Conflict and insecurity, 75% of the model runs. Political terror, 80% of the model runs. Economic performance, which I thought was very interesting. I was not sure how that was going to end up, 62.5%. Public health, 70.8%. Environmental preservation, highest of all. I'm sure glad my co-authors talked me into it, 85.7%. Turns out when you subordinate women, yeah, you subordinate Mother Nature too. Demographic security, not surprisingly, high, 71.4%. Education, 60%. Social progress, 75%. Overall, if you look at all of the model runs we did, all right, 71.3% of those model runs showed that the subordination of women at the household level, right, that first political order, was the difference between scoring well and scoring poorly on those national outcome measures. Some of you may prefer odds ratios to regression output. And so we performed a whole bunch of logistic regressions in order to calculate those odds ratios. And so for every step worse that you take in the subordination of women, you see the correspondingly higher odds of having a negative outcome on these outcome variables. So for each step you take worse in subordinating women, you have over twice the chance of being a fragile state. Over 3.5 times the chance of having a government that's more autocratic, less effective, more corrupt. 1.5 times the chance of being unstable and violent, and so on and so forth. 1.5 times the chance of having a low GDP per capita. 1.5 times the chance of having low environmental quality. Almost twice the chance of having a high fertility rate. 1.8 times the chance of scoring badly on the Global Hunger Index. So, curse your women, curse your nation state, right? We have found that the association holds very robustly. Rose McDermott of Brown University, taking a look at our findings and the findings of others who have done this kind of work, had this to say. She says, the findings are clear, consistent, and statistically robust across the board. In fact, the results are the kind of thing most social scientists strive for, but almost never find in the course of their careers. If these findings were about something not related to women, chances are they would be treated as revolutionary in international relations theory. Indeed, the effects are much stronger than those supporting the notion of the democratic peace that has spawned an entire cottage industry of inquiry. I leave it to the reader to ponder why powerful effects regarding the treatment of women on the health and security of states do not receive such extensive attention. In terms of theory building, we posit that there are possibly 3 causal pathways at work in these associations that we're seeing in this aggregate statistical analysis. First of all, there's what we call the boot camp pathway. That is, there is no better training camp for political violence and instability than lived domestic terror perpetration, lived domestic corruption, lived domestic autocracy. And indeed, other scholars have corroborated our findings. For example, Ellen Bjarnegard and Eric Melander have found that one of the strongest predictors of hostile attitudes towards minority groups and foreigners, as well as a strong predisposition or desire to commit political violence, is holding gender unequal beliefs, right? That first other, the woman, how the woman is treated at the household level becomes the template for how all others are treated. And if the first template of dealing with that first other is domestic violence, then political violence will seem not only unremarkable, but perhaps highly functional. Second, as I pointed out in my examples, many of these structural mechanisms that subordinate women also create chronic structural goads for the society to engage in political violence. So things like inflationary bride price, prevalent polygyny, sex ratio alteration. It's as if, you're taking one leg off of your 4-legged chair, right? That society you've baked instability right into that society by having these subordinative practices concerning women. And then lastly, you're subordinating women. That is, you're disempowering the very individuals whose influence could profoundly challenge this calculus of political violence. So we think that these 3 causal pathways are what's at work here. So when I give this presentation back in DC, and I'm often called upon, to talk to a variety of policymakers and DoD staff and so forth, I ask them, do you consider yourself a national security realist? And of course, they all say, of course, we're realists, yes. There's no other answer you can give. You can't say, oh, I'm a national security idealist. No, we are all national security realists. We see the world as it really is. Well, and then I say, well, in light of the empirical findings I've just given you, are you a realist if you believe that the treatment of women does affect national security and stability? And are you a realist if you believe the women, peace, and security agenda, right, of incorporating women's participation, women's perspectives, women's concerns, and so forth into security planning is probably a good thing? And then I ask them sort of the kicker question, which is, in light of what I've shown you, can you call yourself a realist if you don't believe these things, right? Are you really a realist if you think that women have nothing to do with national security? So at that point, most of them say, okay, I get it, but what would change? What would we do differently? Well, I think there's a number of things that we would do differently when we become true realists. If the US is not tracking the situation of women, especially at the household level, how's it going to have an effective foreign policy? For example, the government spends hundreds of millions of dollars on conflict forecasting. I can tell you that virtually none of those forecasting models have any gender variables in them at all. That's crazy. That's insane. How are you going to accurately anticipate instability if you don't even know linkages such as between bride price and polygyny and, rebel recruitment? right? If you're not modeling these things, you're not going to understand, you're not going to be situationally aware. How, if the US is approaching a situation where a variety of subnational actors are vying for power within the society and the US has to decide if they should back any of them, how is the US going to decide which subnational actors are most likely to bring stability in the long term if it doesn't first examine how each group treats women and intends to treat women if it got into power? How do you think we ended up with the Taliban in the first place? The United States didn't care what the Taliban intended to do to women or what it was doing to women when it was in its incarnation as the Mujahideen, right? It was only afterward that we realized how utterly destabilizing of that society groups with such highly gender unequal beliefs would be. How will the US avoid the trap of peace negotiations where the rights of women are bargained away to make peace between warlords if it doesn't understand the linkage between sustainable peace and the empowerment of women? I'm sure many of you know that it's been shown that peace agreements last far longer, significantly longer, when women are involved in the negotiations and are able to bring up questions and issues that otherwise would never be brought up. Those peace agreements last far longer. How would the US track which of its own citizens are the greatest internal threat if domestic violence is not viewed as a serious threat? I think you're familiar with some of the studies that have shown that virtually all of our mass shooters and terror perpetrators within the last 20 years in the United States have one thing in common. They've either been accused of or arrested for domestic violence. Remember our boot camp causal pathway, right? That is, what better boot camp is there to see the functionality of political violence than domestic violence perpetration? So we see accusations and arrests for domestic violence against mothers, against their sisters, against their girlfriends, against their wives. This is a common denominator. How will the US rationally approach immigration policy if it doesn't understand, right, that it's not about what country you're from, it's about how you intend to treat women once you come to this country, right? That's the real clash of civilizations, right? You can be importing instability if you import practices that subordinate women. And this is one of the reasons why the country of Australia has recently changed its citizenship test. It now has explicit questions on the test. Is it legal in Australia to do female genital cutting? Is it legal in Australia to beat your wife? Is it legal in Australia to marry your daughter off without her consent? Okay. These are now part of the citizenship test, which speaks to me that Australia has an idea of what would destabilize their society. How will the US know that ending child marriage worldwide would do more for world peace than almost any other investment? My class and I were talking about it this week, how child marriage is a hub issue affecting virtually everything else in the society, miring generations to come in poverty, in ignorance, and in ill health. We would do more for world peace by trying to end child marriage than anything else. And then how would the US know when exporting democracy makes sense and when it doesn't? If at the household level, all you have are mini autocracies, then veneering electoral democracy on top of such a society is not going to get you anything but an illiberal democracy that functions much more like an autocracy than it does a democracy. No, better wait for societies or point your democratization efforts towards societies that have begun to make the transition towards a lessened subordination of women. So I believe one day that the idea that foreign policy or national security policy could ignore the situation of women will be laughably naive. I like to daydream about a future generation 30, 40 years from now that look back at our textbooks in national security and just burst out laughing that we could have had an entire textbook that doesn't even mention that there's women on the planet Earth and that doesn't understand that what's going on with women has a lot more to do with national security than one would believe, at least in some circles today. So to end, what I'd like to suggest is that given what we've done with this empirical analysis, I think it's completely fair to say that women's insecurity profoundly and significantly undermines state security. I think Hillary Clinton said it best when she was Secretary of State in 2012. She said, "The subjugation of women is a threat to the common security of our world and to the national security of our country." And I think she's absolutely right. And I think disrupting the weak points of this syndrome may be foundational to undercutting the roots of instability, conflict, and ineffective governance in our international system. I think that adopting those women, peace, and security lenses are going to make our policies more effective. And I'm really glad to see the WPS Act of 2017 mandates that our government do just that. Well, that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for coming. I'm really eager to hear your questions and respond to them. And so I'll just let Professor Huang take over, and I'll stop sharing my PowerPoint right now.
Thank you, Professor Hudson. We have a number of questions from the audience. Some I received prior to the event. They were provided when participants registered for the event, and some came in as you were speaking. So I'm going to paraphrase them a little bit, put some of these together because there are some common themes running through some of these questions, but some pertain to your findings, the implications of your findings, and many pertain to, well, what can we do about this? So let's start with some of the questions that address your findings. And here is an interesting one, I think, to start with. Can you speak more about the countries that receive a 0 to 2 on the so-called syndrome index that you've compiled? Say the United States, for example, I noticed gets a 0 to 2. Is there not gender imbalance here, or are they merely hidden?
Oh, perfect question. Absolutely. The United States scores a 2, and that's primarily because of its high levels of violence against women. Now, they're not the highest levels of violence against women, but they're still pretty darn high. And that's why they end up at 2. If they'd had one more point, they would have ended up in a different category altogether. But you're right, a lot of it is hidden and invisible because there's more than just violence going on, even though I think the violence is pretty darn important. I think there are still some inequities in family law that women face, for example, as they try to navigate divorce or even child support from fathers maybe to whom they were never married in the first place. I think there are other types of barriers for women, but in terms of the really explicit barriers like differences in property rights, in the law, a bride price, dowry, and so forth, fortunately, we're lacking those. But please do not take that 0 to 2 ranking for the United States as any sort of exhortation that we are doing terrifically well, because we certainly are not doing terrifically well.
Thank you. We have another question about the syndrome, as you call it. Why does it develop and amplify in certain places if we can all acknowledge that it's detrimental to everyone?
Well, unfortunately, there are some beliefs that suggest that it is not detrimental. And that's really the trouble point, right? Is that people see these mechanisms whereby female interests are systematically subordinated to male interests as producing a healthy and strong and secure society. All right, we're here to tell you that that's dead wrong. But these beliefs, don't imagine that it's simply in some exotic locale somewhere, say in sub-Saharan Africa. All you have to do is to go to a men's rights group online, and you will see the exact same assertion that our country went to hell in a handbasket when women were given the vote or were given property rights, and that if only we could put women back in their place, that our society would be healed. So I think this is a very universal type of belief. Fortunately, in Western cultures, it is currently a minority belief, right? In other cultures, it's a majority belief, and that's why you see, orange and red countries. So I think the reason that we took the approach we did is to say, okay, no matter what you think about women's place, okay, let's talk about the outcomes that you get when you subordinate women. And let's see how uniformly negative those consequences are. Do you want to rethink, right, your premise that keeping women subordinated is the key to a happy, healthy, and secure country, when we can show you it's the key to the opposite? We'll see if that changes any minds or hearts.
Great. Let me broaden the conversation a little bit here. This is a question I had as well, and it's also coming from the audience, which is in the United States and globally this year, we've had lots of conversations surrounding the issue of race in our society and racial politics. How would you say your discussion of the gender dynamics in various countries intersect and interact with other political orders that exist and that are hugely important to how societies function?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And I believe that there's a lot of intersectionality. Absolutely. We do know that the first subordination of an other is based on sex, because we have societies that are completely homogeneous in terms of race and religion and ethnicity and language, and women are still subordinated. So we know that the first difference that, say, children are noting within the society is that there's a difference in sex between their mother and their father. And they are looking to see how this difference is processed, right? Does it create an inequality? Does it create violence? Does it create difference in power within the household? And if it does, then that child is going to be predisposed to treat any difference just like the sexual difference is treated. So race, right? Minority races will be seen as feminized, right? Minority religions will be seen as feminized. These would be feminized outgroups that are deserving of being treated precisely like women are treated under the first political order. And I think we see this, all right? I think we absolutely see research showing that highly gender unequal beliefs are strongly associated with xenophobia and hostility towards minority groups. So I think there's definitely something to that, right? I think there is a deep intersectionality there.
Great, and just so you know, Professor Hudson, the questions are coming in nonstop. So you've already created lots of discussion and questions in everyone's minds.
That's great.
Let's take another one that's related to what's going on right now. And that has to do with the pandemic. Let's see. Does the displacement of women from the workforce in the US caused by the pandemic have a great impact on national security? And let's say both in the short term and in the long term?
Actually, I think it's even broader than COVID, right? I think in addition to COVID, which has definitely disproportionately affected women, caused many to drop out of the labor force and many to have their careers stalled. I think that's hugely important. But I also see COVID in tangent with kind of a movement to, it's not as extreme as the men's rights activists, certainly not. But there seems to be some sort of, ethos in the air that the erosion of women's rights, for example, in reproductive decision-making, would be a positive good for the society. And I'm not here, to argue, differences in abortion. I think I have a pretty, centrist, mixed view on abortion, but I sort of feel it in the air, right? That, women's rights are something that maybe can be taken away at a moment's notice. And that's certainly what we saw in the Arab uprising, right, of 2011. With the possible exception of Tunisia, virtually every government that fell during the uprising ushered in a new government whose first item on the agenda was to reverse the gains that women had made. All right. So in Egypt, the very first thing that the Muslim Brotherhood short-term government did was take away the women's quota in the legislature, and taking away women's divorce rights were going to be number 2 before they were overthrown in a coup. The Libyan Transitional Federal Government, the TFG, I mean, they had civil war on their hands, but the first thing that all of them could agree upon was the re-legalization of polygamy in Libya. It was just amazing to see how there comes a time when populist movements, right, really appeal to this sort of long buried kind of notion that women are out of their place and they need to be put back in their place. So while I'm not sure we're going to see short-term issues, I am looking at the medium and long term and wondering whether sort of this recession for women specifically is going to have some outsized effects on security. Yep, I'm thinking about the same lines that the questioner is thinking.
Great. We have more questions based on your data. Do you have time series data on the syndrome variables? And if so, are you seeing any trends over time?
Oh, that's a marvelous question. On the syndrome, no, because we operationalized it basically in 2017, 2018, and ran our analyses there. So certainly we don't have a second time point. However, the syndrome is an outgrowth of the WomenStats database project, which is one of the largest databases on the status of women worldwide. And our data is pretty robust from 1995 onward. So we do, in fact, have time series data on a number of phenomena. And I can tell you one that hasn't changed and one that has changed. All right, one that hasn't changed is the physical insecurity of women. We've seen virtually no improvement in the physical security of women as operationalized through things like murder of women, suicide of women, domestic violence, rape, and so forth. One of the things we have seen remarkable improvement in is laws on the age of marriage. Not practice, but laws on the age of marriage are becoming almost standard worldwide at 18. There is now only a small handful of nations that hold out for younger ages for legal marriage for girls. We still do have one nation that has no minimum age of marriage for girls. Did you know that? Where girls can be married off as young as, say, 5. Would it surprise you to know that it's Yemen, which is currently in the midst of a horrific civil war? Do I think that that's coincidental? No, of course, on the basis of my empirical analysis, I suggested that that's not coincidental at all.
And what do you believe are the implications of the syndrome for interstate relations? For instance, the poorest rated states seem to be the Middle Eastern and Sub-Saharan and North African states, according to your data. So could you speak to how your findings would be distinct from alternative explanations, such as the scholars who point to the effect of Islam on cultural practices, or previous incidences of colonialism, etc.? So how did you sort through these multiple factors that would contribute to the outcomes that you have been studying?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that, because we were very concerned about that too. So one of our 7 control variables was actually operationalized on the basis of Samuel Huntington's work on the clash of civilizations. So we actually controlled for Islam and so forth. We also included colonial heritage. So we looked at which nations had a history of colonialism and which did not. And I'm here to tell you that neither variable ever turned out to be significant in these regression analyses that we did. It's easiest to see with civilizations. So for example, it's certainly not only Islam, all right, where you can find deeply subordinative practices concerning women. It's also India, right? It's also places like Papua New Guinea. It's also places like Sub-Saharan Africa that's non-Islamic. There are other places as well, the Caucasus. So I think the idea that somehow Islam is the genesis of this is, I can show that empirically to be untrue. And it's also likewise that colonial status did not turn out to be significant in this as well. Now, though, you know, all aggregate statistical analysis is kind of coarse and rough. So I'm not saying that in no case did these things make a difference. But in terms of colonial versus non-colonial, Islam versus the rest of the world, they were not significant.
We have many questions about now what? Now that you've informed us of your findings and how vital they are to everything we would want to know about national and international security. So here are some of the, so what do we do kinds of questions that I've been getting here. How do we as a society challenge the gender bias often present in interactions between men and women, whether in business or in politics? So now we are armed with the knowledge. What can we as individuals do about this, if anything?
Well, that's a great question too. And it's actually, I think, the most meaningful question, right? Which is, what do we do as individuals and as societies? And we have 3 parts of our book. One is theory, the second is the empirics, but the final section of the book is all about the dynamics of change. Okay, so how can we kind of nudge the world into a more stable situation by looking at what's going on with women? And I think I'm going to actually try to share my screen one more time. Yeah, there it is. And let's just do this one here. Okay. Here's some examples, but there's so much more in that part 3. If you really, really want to make a difference, I want you to read part 3. But here's some examples of things that can be done or are already happening in certain cultures. For example, I think that they're already being suborned is the norm of patrilocal marriage. I think increasing urbanization undercuts the types of living arrangements that you need to support patrilocal marriage. So that's certainly already happening. In terms of policy interventions, those countries that are dealing with sex ratio alterations often find that by tweaking just one thing, they can get outsized effects that ameliorate sex ratio alteration. And what is that one thing? It's the provision of pensions for their elderly. In societies based around patrilineal lines, it is your sons that are obligated to take care of the elderly parents. And so many societies have just said, hey, we're not providing pensions, your sons are your pension. And so as a result, people are very reluctant not to have a son, not to have several sons. And this is one of the reasons that sex ratio alteration can be catalyzed. What we found, for example, in South Korea, which at the turn of the century, and I mean this past century, so 2000, had a highly abnormal birth-sex ratio and now has a nearly normal birth-sex ratio. One of the things they did was to introduce old age pensions. And when they did, then all of a sudden the calculus about whether sons or daughters were more important for the future completely changed. Because while a son, may write a check or do an e-bank transfer to you, it's your daughter that's going to come over and cook you a meal and make sure you're well taken care of because of gendered socialization within the culture. And so people are now saying that daughters are now the true wealth within the society. So fascinating to see how the alteration of economic incentives can breed change just within the space of 20 years. And then there are two other areas indicated by the red arrows where we think that actually international attention, international public opinion, regional organizations such as the OAU, sort of banding together to create new regional norms, have really made a difference. And one of those is increasing the age of marriage for girls. As I said previously, there's been a strong effort globally, fueled by global and regional NGOs as well as IGOs to raise the minimum age of marriage for girls to 18. And so while practice is certainly lagging behind these laws, I think that's kind of low-hanging fruit. It is so easy to show how devastating child marriage is to a society that you'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to see it. So I think that's a place where we can make great progress. Another place where progress is being made is title to land. And that there's been some very active work by third-party governments, IGOs, NGOs, to make sure that married women are co-titled on land titles. And this kind of co-titling, I think, is extremely important for redressing the difference in decision-making power between men and women. So those are just a few ideas, but we have many ideas. For example, we talk about how religion doesn't have to be the enemy. Religion can be a friend to women, but that negotiation must be held in a strategically astute manner. Let's just put it that way.
What I personally find really fascinating about your theory is how you're able to explain these macro level and macro political and macro social factors and outcomes, such as political violence in a country or levels of economic development or how governments respond to climate change. And yet you link that way down to what happens within homes and within the household. And so you have these multiple layers from the very intimate places where these gender imbalances play out to the much broader social and even international outcomes that we see from that.
And I think there's a follow-on to that, which is that while I am all in favor of increasing women's literacy and women's labor force participation and women's parliamentary representation, you can't expect that those things are really going to empower women. Okay, we have too many examples in the world where great progress has been made on all three of those indicators, and women are still extremely subordinated at the household level, and you still get the types of outcomes that we found in our analysis. So yes, do those things, right? We're not saying don't do those things, do those things, but they need to be coupled with attention, I think, to that household first political order to be successful in empowering women within the society.
And I think that relates to what it will be our final question for the evening, which is you mentioned that laws can change, but the practice changes often lag behind. So if we're seeing all of these legal changes and advancements around the world, which you indicated are signs of progress, are those movements enough to see the outcomes that we would like to see? And how do you bring about the societal changes? How do you make sure that those practices change in accordance with the laws? And are the legal changes really the first step here?
I'm so glad you asked that. Because that's, I think, the $64,000 question is you can legislate till you're blue in the face and things might not change. A perfect example is India. India now has the worst birth sex ratio ever recorded for the country since independence. It's gotten worse and worse over time, even though it's completely illegal to have a sex-selective abortion. It's completely illegal to tell a woman the sex of her fetus, either through amniocentesis or ultrasound. And yet the sex ratios are inexorably worse every single year. So it's clear that legislation is not enough, right? But it seems to me that there's got to be a pincer movement. All right, it's not that the legal change is completely worthless. No, of all things, the first thing the law is a teacher of what is right and what is wrong. And so to have these things, such as sex-selective abortion, be outlawed in India is critically important. It'll be important to future generations to build upon that standard that the law says this is wrong. But that top down isn't going to get you anywhere without the bottom up, right? And unfortunately, this is something, again, that we were talking about in our class just this very week. Oftentimes, you have to use rather brute economic methods to change people's calculus in the short term, right? We talked about providing pensions, right, to deal with sex ratio alteration. That means the government having to pony up real bucks, not just for billboards telling you that you should keep your daughter, but money that you give to people, all right, if they keep their daughter. Unfortunately, if you want short-term change, then you're going to have to make it economically rational for people to change the way they do things. However, with change in the law, economic incentive reform, you can have a pincer movement that I think lays the foundation for a change in mindset over time. As those daughters are kept and not culled, as family after family says, well, yeah, we're not doing that, right? I think that gets transmitted over time and can become a new norm. Maybe I'm just being optimistic here because I also tell my students that when there is a sudden exigency, like a regime change, illegal kind of regime change or violent regime change, or when there's some sort of catastrophe, people often revert, right, to a very subordinative political order for women. We saw it with the Arab uprising. We saw it in the revolution in Iran in 1979. We see it in lots of places. So I think that you can never rest. You can never say, okay, we've changed this norm. We don't have to worry anymore. I don't think that's ever the case. I think even in the most advanced nations like the United States, we still have to be vigilant about possible rollback of women's rights. And I think we see that playing out in our society right now in 2020. So I think there can be change, but you're never going to be able to rest on your laurels and assume that that change will hold forever.
Thank you so much, Professor Hudson, for a fascinating, informative, and very inspiring talk this evening. Please join me in thanking Professor Hudson.
Thank you. I had a ball. The questions were fantastic. And Professor Huang, thank you so much for being here and moderating the discussion. And Lauren, thank you to you as well.
Thank you for letting us host you. This was a great talk and we've received a lot of positive feedback still coming in right now in the chat. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and this talk will be posted on our webpage in the near future.
So Lauren, save me that chat. I would love to read all the questions that we didn't have time to get around to.
I absolutely will.
Okay, thank you everyone. It was a delightful evening. Thank you.